Hello everyone, welcome to our Egyptian Online Seminar group. First, keep your microphones off. Then, if you have any questions, you can ask our speaker during his presentation or after his presentation. I have great pleasure of welcoming Professor Philip. Philip is an associate professor at Arizona State University. Professor Philip's research examines a widely range of topics in auditing, regulations of auditing, and corporate governance. His research has been published in top-ranking journals including a Journal of Accounting and Economics, the Accounting Review of Accounting Studies, Contemporary Accounting Research, Accounting Organization and Society. He is a member of an editorial board of Contemporary Accounting Research and the Accounting Review. Now we will start our seminar with Professor Philip.
All right. Well, thank you very much. This is a real opportunity and a pleasure for me to share some my current work. And I never thought that I would be speaking with new friends from Egypt from my house. So thank you for this invitation. Thank you for this opportunity. And if you have questions, just feel free to either use the raise your hand feature or just chime in. That's kind of what I'm used to, and your comments and questions are certainly welcome. So this paper, I'll kind of be looking this way because this is where my screen is. This paper, it's a co-authored paper with two former PhD students from Arizona State University. Wei is at the University of Massachusetts, and Mike is at Baylor University. And it's a paper where, the title is also the exact research question that we're investigating. Does PCAOB regulatory enforcement deter non-sanctioned auditors? Okay. And so what I mean by non-sanctioned auditors is, does enforcement by the PCAOB have an effect on the auditors that are not the subject of the enforcement, meaning the neighboring audit firms surrounding the sanctioned firm? How do they respond to this enforcement by the PCAOB, if any? Okay. So while this is really a U.S. study, I think the notion of the study is relevant to standard enforcement oversight bodies throughout the world. Is there some sort of efficiency gain through enforcement? Okay, so does enforcement only affect the party of the enforcement, or is there some sort of spillover? Okay. And that's really what we are trying to investigate here. Okay, so so the research question: does PCAOB enforcement serve as a deterrence function for non-sanctioned auditors? Okay. And why do we think that this is interesting, or what kind of prompted us to look at this? If you look at, arrange things slightly here. If you look at kind of, the history of auditor oversight in the United States, as well as kind of the academic studies, the PCAOB, the oversight body for auditors in the United States, was created with the Sarbanes-Oxley Act back in 2002. There's thousands of papers that have kind of looked at this broadly. So with this, the PCAOB was given inspection, enforcement, and standard setting authority. And from a regulatory economics perspective, there's debate over the costs and benefits of public versus private enforcement. Public enforcement now being this oversight body. Okay, and what kind of struck us is there's very little evidence or study, if you will, on the effects of PCAOB's enforcement. Okay, so there's not a lot that we understand. Okay, or that's been investigated empirically from an academic standpoint on PCAOB enforcement. Okay, so that's part of the motivation of why we're looking at this. And there's been a lot more research that has looked at the PCAOB's inspection program. Okay, so for example, there's papers that show improvements to audit quality. There's these spillover benefits as a result of the PCAOB's inspection program. Okay. Reporting credibility is improved. And then if you switch to the enforcement, okay, there's really primarily two studies that have looked at the initial enforcement action against Deloitte and Touche back, sorry, I'm just going to arrange one more thing here. I think back in 2007, and the focus for these studies was the effect on Deloitte and their clients. Okay. Our focus is to look at the surrounding auditors that are not the focus, or that they're not the subject of the sanction. Okay, so how does it impact these non-sanctioned auditors? Okay. So from a practical standpoint, okay, enforcement is costly. Okay, I think, you know, last I looked, the PCAOB's enforcement budget is around $22 million a year, give or take. But if you look at the fines that are collected, they're relatively nominal. You know, particularly from smaller audit firms, they're relatively nominal. And so, is there some sort of efficiency gain with this public enforcement? Is really what we're trying to see. Okay. Are the regulatory effects beyond the fines that are collected? Okay. Here is kind of the rule. Okay. So the PCAOB can conduct an investigation, and it's actually quite broad-reaching. The PCAOB can conduct an investigation of any act or practice or omission to act by a registered public accounting firm, meaning those audit firms in the those audit firms that conduct audits of companies that are listed in the United States. Any act or omission to act by any registered public accounting firm, an associated person, or the firm, or both, that may violate any provisions of SOX, the rules of the board, provisions of securities laws, regardless of how the act is brought to their attention. Okay, so the enforcement authority from the PCAOB is quite broad, and their ability to investigate and then, you know, determine whether or not some sort of discipline should take place can be quite far-reaching. Here is what the enforcement process looks like. So the PCAOB, you know, can become aware of some sort of violation, and this can be through, you know, through any source. It can be through their inspection program or any other, you know, information source. At that point in time, they investigate the violation. Okay, the firm or the individual who's the subject of the investigation then has an opportunity to respond. Okay, and depending upon that response, the PCAOB then decides whether or not to take some sort of disciplinary proceeding. Okay, and once the decision to take some sort of disciplinary action has been made, the audit firm can either settle and accept the discipline that's been provided to them, or they can litigate. Okay. If the audit firm chooses to litigate, a hearing officer is brought in and makes a decision. Okay. Either party can then appeal the decision to the enforcement staff. It can then go to the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is kind of a big brother, if you will, to the PCAOB. And only at either the settlement or allowance of the SEC is the discipline made public. Okay. And, you know, I shared kind of the process with you. What we're, you know, kind of the event, if you will, that we're looking at is this, when the discipline is made public. So there's a lot that goes behind the scenes that's all, you know, handled privately between the PCAOB and the auditing firm. And by law, the PCAOB can't make anything public until it's been either settled or the SEC has allowed them to make it public. Okay. And so we're interested in this event because, you know, the auditing firm, in my mind, has very little incentive to make it known or make it public that they're under investigation from the PCAOB. And by law, the regulator, the PCAOB, can't make it publicly known, okay, until it's allowed by the SEC, or the subject party has settled. So what are the potential outcomes of this enforcement? Individuals can be censured, or audit firms can be censured. What this effectively means is the individual or the audit firm gets their name publicly shamed, if you will, but there's no real teeth to it. There's nothing of substance that really happens. They can also have monetary penalties, you know, so the PCAOB can fine individuals or audit firms. And then, you know, it gets more egregious from there, where an individual can be barred from being employed in an auditing firm that audits public companies in the United States. Okay, so that, in my mind, that effectively means a career change for that individual. Okay. And then lastly, and the focus of what we're looking at, is the PCAOB can revoke an audit firm's registration with the PCAOB. And what that means is that then prevents that auditing firm from providing audits to public companies in the United States. So this is kind of the biggest hammer that the PCAOB has from an enforcement standpoint. And so our view, our interest was to see, is there some sort of spillover effect from enforcement by the PCAOB? And if there is, it's probably going to happen with a revoked registration, or the most punitive potential enforcement outcome that the PCAOB has. Okay, so that's the focus of our study. So from a hypothesis standpoint, you know, typically auditors' incentives, you know, if you read in the auditing literature, auditors' incentives are most frequently driven by reputation risk and litigation risk. Okay, so, you know, a lot of the academic research, et cetera, is motivated by these two kind of underlying things, you know, primarily in the United States, right, where the potential for litigation varies throughout the world, and liability for auditors varies throughout the world. In the United States, you know, reputation and litigation are the two things that are most frequently talked about as far as an incentive standpoint for auditors. Okay. There's another, you know, incentive creator for auditors, which is also enforcement, or which is also the regulatory oversight mechanism. Okay, and that's that, you know, the regulator is going to shape how auditors also behave. Okay, and so in our view, if there's some sort of PCAOB enforcement outcome, right, that an auditor is made aware of, that's going to be a signal of heightened regulatory risk for an audit firm, a non-sanctioned audit firm. Okay, and we expect that, you know, the surrounding audit firms, you know, in close geographic proximity, are going to respond. Okay, you know, there's literature that shows that deterrence effects are localized, meaning, so in our view, if an auditor has been sanctioned in a certain city, the auditors that are most likely to respond are going to be those auditors that are surrounding or in close proximity to that sanctioned audit firm. Okay. You know, and there's potential, you know, I would say tension, right, in this idea, because if you go back to, you know, this item 9, if you will, you know, when the discipline is made public, it can be, you know, potentially 2 or 3 years after, you know, the infraction, if you will, or the commencement of the initial investigation. So there can be a potential significant delay between between the commencement of the investigation and the publication of the enforcement. So there's some potential tension there as to whether or not we would see an outcome. I saw a couple of things coming in the comments. I just wanted to make sure that there was. I'll try to be clearer with my voice. So, okay. So there's potential tension, right, or the possibility that these neighboring audit firms may not respond. Okay, given this delay. So our prediction, our hypothesis is, if audit firms are going to respond, or let me rephrase that, if PCAOB enforcement signals some sort of heightened regulatory risk and negative regulatory outcomes are correlated with low audit quality, audit firms are going to provide higher audit quality after the revelation of an enforcement against another audit firm in the local market. Okay, so that's our basic prediction. Yes. That is the basic prediction. So are there any questions? I've never gotten to slide 10 before without questions, so it's perfectly fine if there aren't any questions. So here's what we've done, okay? So what we did is we went and gathered all of the PCAOB's disciplinary orders from 2005 up through 2015. And we've collected data from two common data sources, Audit Analytics and CompuStat. And our interest is really in the response by these non-sanctioned firms, okay? And so what we've done, or what we do, is we exclude all of the clients of a sanctioned audit firm, because there's the potential that these firms are, quote, contaminated, if you will, or they may be lower quality. They may be lower quality firms, and so we're really interested in the response of the non-sanctioned firms, and so we've stripped out all of the clients and former clients of a sanctioned audit firm. Okay. We also exclude clients of the largest audit firms in the United States, and we do that because, number one, it's very unlikely that the threat of a revoked registration is a real threat to these firms. These audit firms are the largest firms. They have, nearly constant contact with the PCAOB. They're inspected each year by the PCAOB, and so in our mind, the threat of a potential revoked registration is not really real, okay, for these firms. And then we also exclude clients of foreign audit firms. In our sample, there were relatively few enforcement actions against foreign audit firms, and we're looking for this localized effect. So that's what we've done. Okay.
Philip, I have a quick question here. I'm just,
Yes.
Excuse me if I'm actually an outsider. I'm a finance professional, so I don't have much background about the auditing. But give me like an overview of the type of sanctions that you have seen in your sample. Is it kind of clustered around a specific industry, or is it clustered around a specific audit firm?
So the enforcement is at the audit firm level. Okay, so the enforcement we're looking at where they revoke an audit firm's registration is the event is at the audit firm level. Now, I don't think that we have, if the question is, what's kind of the industry of the client companies, I don't think we've looked if there's some sort of industry concentration that these sanctioned firms were kind of concentrated in. Is that your question?
Mainly the question is how you are sanctioned these type of audit. Is it based on a specific case that they have done kind of I'm not sure how to explain it, kind of a bad behavior in their audit process? Is it something that is related to specific clients, or is it more of an overall operation of the auditor firms themselves?
Okay, I see. Great question. It's, from our view, or from what we've seen, it's primarily related to low audit quality or poor quality audits, or yes. So I don't know if that answers your question sufficiently, but yes, it's primarily related to low audit quality, and either they've explicitly violated rules of the PCAOB, but it primarily stems from the audit firm providing low quality audits.
But you're not able to determine what specific cases that you have a lower audit quality. You're just talking about the overall perception of the audit quality process of the auditor, right?
I mean, I can show, like right here on this slide, you can see, and we've kind of just grouped audit quality failures into one bucket. You can also see there's violations of auditor independence rules and failure to cooperate with PCAOB inspectors. But as far as looking at specifically what the underlying audit quality failure is, we haven't really tabulated that. Is your thinking that might provide some?
I'm just trying to understand, is it, an overall evaluation of the auditor themselves, or is it related to specific clients that the auditor did not do it? So is it mainly coming from, careless job by the auditor for the clients that actually they're trying to take advantage of the auditor's process or auditing process? Or is it because the auditors themselves, they are not doing a good job in handling the audit process? And again, I'm sorry if I'm an outsider and that question is not related, but I was trying to understand how that would help, because I believe that if you start looking at this from a perspective of a finance profession, it can be very interesting if it's related to the client. But if it's related only to the auditors, maybe that's more of a disciplinary action, and that will try to, help the auditor to improve their process. But if it's a specific client, there might be a lot of consequences that you can expect in the financial market after this disciplinary action.
Okay. It's, I guess the short answer, it could be both. It could be either or both. The discipline is at the audit firm level, meaning the audit firm has either violated rules or, had egregiously low audit quality. So the discipline is at the audit firm level, and it's a result of the audit firm, to use very simple terms, doing something they shouldn't have done.
Thank
so
you.
It's not about the actions of the clients per se. It's really at the audit firm level.
If Franklin, you can ask, yeah.
What was that, Mohammed?
McKinnon, you can ask. Yes.
Yes, I just wanted to help clarify. The PCAOB will usually create or develop an enforcement action as a result of an inspection of a particular audit. So they're inspecting, let's say, 20 audit engagements from each firm every year. And in the course of inspecting the audit, they'll see a violation of audit standards by that firm and by that team. And they'll look and say, is this specific to this engagement? Let's look at some of the other engagements that we're inspecting this year. Let's see if this is a general problem that the firm has. Is it a problem with this particular partner who may have responsibility for more than one audit, even when we don't inspect? And so it's usually generated by the inspection process, which is very company specific, but it may develop into a generalized criticism of the firm or a generalized criticism of that particular partner or a group of partners in a particular industry. And they'll say they're violating this auditing standard over and over again, and they're doing it on purpose, and it's egregious, and it affects the integrity of the audit process and potentially the integrity of the financial reporting process. So it depends, but it usually springs from the inspection of a particular audit.
I appreciate that, because I feel it's intriguing to me, because it opens lots of questions. Are we expecting to see a spillover effect of the other clients that the company has at this point? And I would suspect that this will have a lot of impact, specifically in the year after they have this disciplinary action. I would expect major changes in how they report, and they will be more conservative in the next year. So very interesting. Sorry, I have taken a lot of the time, but
no, that's fine.
I like that.
Yeah, so I'll show you the research design here in a second as to what we're trying to, the effect that we're trying to look at. So, okay, so how we, kind of the trick in this study was how do we design this study to see if there's this spillover effect, right? This response to the enforcement, and does the enforcement then spill over to these other audit firms? So what we've done is we identified, where each sanctioned audit firm resides, and so we identified those audit firms in that same geographic area, and we call this, basically firms from a sanctioned MSA. Okay, and then there are audit firms in geographic areas without a sanction, and we, label these obviously non-sanctioned MSAs. And so in our research design, what we've got is we've got our sanctioned MSAs, okay, and what we're interested in is to see if there's this response by these audit firms in the non-sanctioned audit firms in a sanctioned MSA in this period, 3 years after the enforcement takes place, okay. So our comparison, what we're comparing is this period right here to the pre-period for these firms in a sanctioned MSA, and we're also including the control group audit firms and their clients in these non-sanctioned MSAs. Okay, we include the non-sanctioned MSAs to help us tease out if there's any sort of kind of time effect across time. There's an effect of audit quality across time. Okay, and so we'll include these in the sample. So our interest is if there's some sort of response, we would expect it to show up kind of in this post period right after the enforcement action. And so year T is the year of the first revoked registration in an MSA. Because we're trying to see this initial signal. Okay, and so in order to look, focus on the initial signal, we look at the first revoked registration in a locale. This is what our research design looks like. Okay, so our primary dependent variable is misstatement, meaning if a client's financial statements are subsequently restated, that means that those financial statements were audited at a low enough quality that they had to be fixed later. Okay, so our post variable is an indicator equal to 1 for the periods T0 to T+2, so the 3 years post enforcement. Okay. Post beyond captures, you know, the years after the first of 3 years. And we have a set of control variables that are included to capture, you know, common determinants for misstated financial statements. And then we also include year, audit firm, and location fixed effects to absorb, capture variation in these elements. So, and then, you know, a couple control variables that are noteworthy. You know, there's the possibility, right, that this enforcement signal varies with an audit firm's prior experience with PCAOB oversight. Okay, so, you know, potentially their own experience with the PCAOB's inspection program. Okay, and so what we do is we control for whether or not one of these non-sanctioned auditors had a finding, a deficiency identified by the PCAOB's own inspection program. Okay. And then we also try to control for disruption to the local audit market. Okay. And so what I mean by that is when the PCAOB revokes an audit firm's registration, those former clients of that audit firm have to go somewhere else, right? If they're going to remain listed in the United States, they have to obtain an audit from an audit firm that's registered with the PCAOB. Okay. And so what we try to do is we try to control for how much disruption there was in that local audit market by removing one of these audit firms. Okay. And we also try to control for the disruption to each individual audit firm. Okay. How much change was there in their client portfolio in this period of time? Okay. So our expectation then is if these auditors, you know, after they've received this signal of increased enforcement, if these auditors become more conservative or they're just doing a better job, we expect the coefficient on beta 1 to be negative. Okay, so there's going to be a reduced likelihood of misstatements in this post window. Okay. And then our question number 2, okay, there's not question number 2. Equation number 2, our other measure of audit quality is
Question, dear Prof.
Yes.
Question from Mekanen. You can ask. Mekanen, yeah. Can open your mic.
Yeah, just to follow up on that last slide, why would a non-sanctioned audit firm's portfolio change? I can see if the firm's registration was revoked, there might be a recalibration of the market share of the remaining firms. But why would, what would be the motivation for someone to leave a non-sanctioned firm?
Well, you know, there could be multiple, you know, reasons. All we're trying to do is we're just trying to control for disruption to their portfolio, right? So if they have, you know, if an audit firm for whatever reason either added 10 new clients, that's going to kind of modify the equilibrium that they can provide, or the capacity, availability, et cetera, that they can provide to their clients. So all we're trying to do is just control for this disruption. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, and so our second measure for audit quality is whether or not there is a material weakness in internal control. Okay, and you know, included in this we include disclosure control failures under SOX 302, 404A, and 404B. And you know, the basic logic that we're using is that if auditors, you know, sense or, you know, believe there's a heightened enforcement or regulatory risk, they are going to be more vigilant, more dutiful, higher effort in their audits, and then they're going to be more likely to either identify material weaknesses if they have to report on internal controls, or even if they're not reporting on internal controls, they're going to identify more weaknesses in internal control that management would then have to report under their own reporting requirements. Okay. And so our expectation is that if, post-enforcement, if auditors are doing a better job, for lack of a better term, they're going to identify more material weaknesses, and the coefficient on beta 1 we would expect to be positive. Now, typically, misstatements and material weaknesses are highly positively correlated. However, in the way that this prediction works, our prediction would be that they're opposite. And similar to the previous model, we include year, audit firm, and location fixed effects to difference out variation across time, audit firms and location. So here's kind of some of the data that I can just show you, and you can see that here are the settled disciplinary orders, or these are the enforcement actions that have been settled and made publicly available with the PCAOB. Okay. So to date, there's been, through December of 2015, there were 130. The vast majority are with small audit firms. Okay. And then if you look at, well, what were they? A good majority of them are audit quality failures. So presumably, the vast majority of these are coming through the inspection program. Okay. There's a fair number that relate to failure to cooperate with PCAOB inspectors, meaning lack of response. A number of independence violations, and then, the PCAOB also regulates auditors of broker dealers, and then, that's kind of come at a later point in time. But you can kind of see, what it is that audit firms are getting sanctioned for. And then, here's that same grouping. And what we're interested in, right, is a firm that has had its registration revoked by the PCAOB. Okay. So of the 111 unique audit firms that were sanctioned, 48 had their registration revoked. 27 audit firms actually withdrew their registration with the PCAOB, meaning that they voluntarily left the public company audit market in the United States. And the remaining 35 still have an active registration, meaning they're still auditing public companies in the US. Okay. And then from an individual person standpoint, 105 individuals have been barred, and there have been 63 monetary penalties throughout this period of time. But as you can see, these monetary penalties are relatively nominal. Then what we did is, right, so our focus is on the audit firms that are not the subject of the sanction, right? So this table here is what I would call a validation check to see if we actually collected the data properly. And so, we have 48 audit firms that had revoked registration, and we can see the number that had public company audit clients throughout this kind of period of time, 5 years before the enforcement up to the enforcement. Okay. And the expectation, right, is at the time of enforcement, there's not going to be any that have public company clients, which is an indication that it appears as though we've collected the data properly. And then, I didn't quite catch that. So, and then it just kind of the nature, it's important to think about, who these audit firms are and who their clients are, right? So these are small audit firms, and then therefore they are small audit clients, right? So this is not, we're not necessarily looking at like firms that are in the S&P 1500, right? These are small companies. And so you can see that of the sanctioned clients of the sanctioned firm, okay, the vast majority are non-accelerated filers, meaning these are firms that have a market cap of less than 75 million. Okay, so these are very small firms. You know, we think this is still interesting and important because, you know, this is really an auditing question, and it's about, you know, the effects of enforcement. Okay, so even though, you know, this is a minute share of the U.S. market cap, it's still relevant from an understanding standpoint. Okay, so here's what our sample selection looks like. Okay, so again, this sanctioned MSA, you know, these are the audit firms that are in a city where another audit firm was sanctioned by the PCAOB. Okay. So let me see if there's anything unique that I want to share with you. So we have, you know, so for our misstatement test, there are 25 unique MSAs that get the treatment. Okay. And for the material weakness test, there's also 25 unique MSAs where the treatment occurs. And there's not really much else unique in this to show you. What we then did is we looked at, so our full sample, there's 8,200 observations. Non-sanctioned MSAs, meaning MSAs where an enforcement has not happened, there are about 2,000 observations. And then in the sanctioned MSAs, we partition it from a pre and a post-sanction standpoint, and just kind of look at these, look at our variables of interest. Okay, so about in the pre-enforcement period, in the pre-sanction, about 12% of financial statements are misstated. In the post-enforcement, about 8% are subsequently misstated. Okay, material weaknesses increases quite dramatically. And then, you know, in supplemental tests, we also look at audit fees. You know, do auditors charge more for their audits in this post-enforcement period? And we find that they do. So that's kind of what the descriptive statistics look like for our variables of interest. And then here's the result for our first test. Again, so we're looking at our dependent variable is misstatement, whether or not the financial statements are misstated. And then we also look at, or we kind of partition, or we isolate only to those financial statements that are egregiously misstated. Those where the audit, where the company has to publicly disclose in a filing with the SEC that their financial statements can't be relied upon. And so what we find, and then we also look at all clients of these non-sanctioned auditors, as well as we identify, or we isolate only to those non-accelerated filers. Those are those that are most similar to the clients of a sanctioned firm. Okay. And so what we find is there's about a 2% lower likelihood of a misstatement in this post-enforcement period. Okay. The effect is a little statistically stronger when we limit only to those misstatements that are more egregious. Okay. And so our second test of audit quality is we look at, you know, the dependent variables of material weakness. And again, we look at all companies, and we look at just those that are most similar to the clients of a sanctioned firm. And we find about a, you know, little under a 3% give or take, higher likelihood of a material weakness in this post-enforcement period. Suggestive of, you know, if auditors are more diligent, they're more likely to identify material weaknesses. Okay. or deficiencies in financial reporting, which then have to be reported. So these are the main findings. And then what we do from here is we try to get a little more color, a little more insight into this effect. Okay, so we look at, is this effect, does it vary? Does the effective enforcement vary by the auditor's own reputation risk? Okay. Does the effect vary by how close an audit firm is to the sanctioned firm? So we expected this effect to be localized, right? Some of the geographic areas that we've kind of localized to in our main tests are quite large. For example, the New York, New Jersey, kind of this metropolitan statistical area is quite large. And so we then carve these up to get at, is the effect even more localized within an MSA? And then we then look at and see, is there a potential information source or potential information leak from former clients of the sanctioned firm? Okay. Last, we look at auditor effort, which is fees, and then we have a falsification test with Big Four audit firms, meaning our expectation is that the Big Four firms aren't going to respond, or they don't necessarily care about a revoked registration of a smaller audit firm. Okay, and we find that they in fact do not respond. Okay, and so what it also does is this test also provides some evidence that we're not observing some sort of overall time trend, right? We basically replicate our test with the Big Four audit firms and use the same treatment by location, and we find that there's not a response. So in our mind, that gives us some clarity that what we're observing is not some overall time trend or just some generalized time trend within these locations. Okay. And lastly, we look to see if there's some sort of deterrence effect from these lesser enforcement mechanisms, from the censures, fines, and whether or not an individual is barred by the PCAOB. We find some modest, I would say modest evidence to suggest that there's a response from when an individual is barred by the PCAOB. But we're a little cautious to make any sort of real strong statement about this because the treatment events are very few. Okay, so just to kind of show you some of these results. So with respect to the auditor's reputation risk, what we did is we take this group of small audit firms, okay, and then we partition them by size within this set of small firms. Okay. So the basic argument is that a larger firm has more reputation risk, more litigation risk. They have more to lose, right? So even within the set of small audit firms, the relatively larger firms have more to lose. Okay? And so what we find is that the effect does appear to be concentrated within this set of small firms, the larger audit firms, or they're the ones that appear more likely to have audit quality improvements following an enforcement event. Okay. So the previous table was misstatements. This is the effect on those more egregious misstatements, and this is the effect on identified material weaknesses. Okay, so the effect appears to be really concentrated in the subset of the larger of these small audit firms. Okay. And the next thing we do is we try to see, is this effect even more localized than this MSA area? And so what we see is, what we did is we partition this group of small audit firms by whether or not they are either headquartered in the same city as the sanctioned firm, or they have a client from the same city of the sanctioned firm. Okay, meaning that they have very close crossover they're not just in the same potentially generally larger MSA like New York. Okay. And so what we find is the effect appears to be concentrated in those non-sanctioned firms that have clients in the same city as the sanctioned firm. Okay. And then that result is, you know, pretty consistent across the different dependent variables. And then the next thing we do is we look to see, as I mentioned, if there's some sort of information leak, and presumably through former clients of a sanctioned firm. Okay. So what we do is we partition these audit firms, you know, kind of these non-sanctioned audit firms, we partition them as to whether or not they subsequently picked up a client of the sanctioned firm, right? So the clients of the sanctioned firm, if they're going to remain public companies, they have to get an audit from a registered firm or a remaining registered firm. And what we find is that the effect is not driven by the audit firms that picked up these clients, but rather it looks to be a more generalized effect. And there's not this potential kind of alternative information story. So we think that this is interesting from you know, a policy standpoint, right? If the implications of the study would be different in my mind if what we're showing is kind of this backdoor information leak rather than some generalized spillover effect. But it looks, at least in our mind, it looks to be this more generalized spillover effect of enforcement rather than kind of this side information leak. And then this is the table on material weaknesses. And then our last test that we tabulated was if auditors are going to provide higher quality audits, presumably they're going to want to recover at least some of the cost. And so if they're going to recover some of the cost of higher effort, that should show up in the audit fees that they charge their clients. And so what we see is, you know, even after controlling for time, audit firm, and location fixed effects, audit fees appear to be higher in this post sanction or this post enforcement window. And so, you know, basically what we think we're showing is that audit quality improves. There's not some sort of, you know, side information story, and auditor effort appears to improve. And as I mentioned previously, you know, we don't really see some sort of deterrence effect from these other enforcement mechanisms. Modest evidence from barring individuals, but there's very few isolated treatment events for the barring of an individual. So we're a little cautious to make too strong statements about that. So in summary, we find that misstatements are lower in this post-enforcement period. Material weaknesses, reported material weaknesses are higher. And we think that this is evidence that's consistent with an overall deterrence effect of enforcement by the PCAOB. And, you know, while this is a US-centric study, I think there's things that can be learned from an enforcement standpoint. And then just as a caution, you know, so what we find is that there's this spillover effect within this kind of fragmented set of the audit firms in the United States, right? And so I don't want to overstate the potential deterrence effect from enforcement because it's really isolated within this set of small firms. And so, you know, there should be a caution when interpreting the results that not everybody responds to enforcement. There's not a spillover effect for all audit firms. The spillover effect is rather localized, and it's within one fragment of the auditing profession. So, you know, in my mind, that's to be expected, but that's a caution if someone's trying to take these results and then apply it more broadly. So, with that, thank you very much. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Philip, for your contribution and your effort. It's really excellent presentation. Right now, to Professor Philip answer your questions. Wang from Singapore, you can ask. Dr. Wang?
Yes, Phil, very nice presentation, and also thanks to Wei and Michael, very nice paper. So I think I buy the story in general. Maybe my question a little bit beyond the scope of the study. So my question is, are you interested in, or are you able to find out why some firm or audit firm will improve their audit quality? Is it due to a pure incentive effect, or the incentive related learning effect? For example, they learn some mistake their peer firm may made due to the PCAOB enforcement or inspection. That's why the audit quality improve accordingly. So I think the difference between two is that if it's pure incentive effect, basically they are able to do some right things right before, but they choose not to do so. But the learning effect is that they learn something from PCAOB inspection and their overall ability or competence improve. So I'm not sure whether PCAOB or the regulator are interested in this question, or maybe it's too hard to disentangle these two. And my second question might be related to the first one. So I find you intentionally try to create variable polls, including both 0, first, and second year. So I'm not sure whether if you decompose this polls variable into different years, they can tell how long it will take to for a firm to take action or either learn. For example, learning may take some time, but maybe it's pure incentive effect may not take that long to make everything happen. So just my personal thought upon that.
Yeah, thank you for those thoughts. Those are actually really, with respect to the first one, whether it's incentive or learning, I guess I appreciate what you're saying, that if it's purely incentive, it's something that they could fix immediately, is the point you're making. And if it's learning, they may be seeing something in the enforcement action from the PCAOB or the disciplinary order by the PCAOB that they then learn from, they take and apply to themselves. Admittedly, this has been hard to try and dissect, what the underlying mechanism is that they're responding to. So I know that we have looked at kind of this dynamic model of, partitioning the post years by year. I can't remember off the top of my head what it looked like. But from an interpretation standpoint, if it's incentives, it could show up immediately. And if it's learning, it might take a period or two. And that's something that we'll definitely have to think about. Your point is valid. Is it incentive or learning? So that's something that we need to think about.
I think it's inherently difficult to disentangle two effects at all. A common issue in most of the audit literature, if I may say. So, but I think the regulator may be interested in what's happening, right? What's the driving force? But maybe it's hard to find what's the case as outcome study. So,
yeah.
Thank you so much.
I would like to have some sort of silver bullet to kind of partition what it is. That's something that we can certainly give some more thought. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
If anyone have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your question. Can ask? You can ask. Open your mic. If anyone have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your question. Dr. Can, you can ask. Another question? If there are other questions, you can open your mic and ask your question. Yeah. Goldman, you can ask.
Hey, Phil, how's it going?
Hey, how you doing, Nathan?
Good. Hey, I had a quick question. I was just reading through an older version of the paper online. I was wondering what y'all do in your paper to kind of adjust for some of these differences in PCAOB regimes that have kind of occurred. And what got me thinking a little bit about this is how early on in the PCAOB process, I don't know how credible people thought of a threat they really were and how that's kind of evolved over time and how there's been different opinions on how involved or uninvolved they've been in more recent years.
Well, to answer the question succinctly, we haven't done anything from a PCAOB regime standpoint. You know, we have time fixed effects in there. So yeah, I don't think we haven't done anything from if there's some sort of difference in perception of enforcement, you know, given kind of changes in the board. Yeah, we haven't done anything. I don't know if you have something more in mind to that. If not, but we haven't done anything specific or really thought about kind of the regime differences over time.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's related to this paper or maybe it's an opportunity for a future study for y'all that, you know, there has been, at least from talking with a couple of the inspectors, I know you've got some good connections with some of the inspectors as well, that there has been like differing opinions on how seriously they were taken over time. And if there is a, you know, if there is some sort of difference in responses that firms have based on what they think the PCAOB will actually do. And the example that I always naturally think of is with the Deloitte part 2. Up until that point, no one thought that PCAOB would ever give a part 2 to a big firm like that. So I think it signaled a shift in their credibility of how seriously they're taking things. But I do think maybe it's more related to a future paper, less so related to this current paper for y'all.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and that's something that we can think about. I mean, I think it seems like there's the more recent regime shift is probably the biggest one, which is kind of out of our sample period. Hey, Francine.
Hey, Phil, again, great paper. You know, this is an enormous interest for me. Along the lines of maybe a future paper, I always get the question, why do some enforcement actions come from the PCAOB and why do some come from the SEC? The SEC sanctions firms and individuals sometimes. I think there's an answer for that, but the question is, or the question for research would be, you know, is there a different deterrent effect if the enforcement action comes from the SEC versus the PCAOB? And there might be different kinds of issues that the SEC goes after. I think, you know, the source of where they get those, you know, those potential enforcement actions is different. But, you know, do people, you know, along the lines of what Nathan was saying, the PCAOB is new, relatively new as a regulator. The SEC is not, you know, and from a global perspective also, you know, does the SEC, does something coming from the SEC carry more weight? Plus the SEC, you know about sooner. It's public sooner. The other thing is we've noticed, and I've written about a couple instances where media reported a potential PCAOB investigation. And because of the secrecy, you know, that the PCAOB can't talk about that, it's kind of interesting and curious where those leaks or where that information comes from. And the question is, does that put sort of the potential for a deterrent effect, you know, does that bring it in earlier? Is there a, you know, the PCAOB is looking at this, doesn't matter, does anybody care? Is anybody paying attention to those media reports that the PCAOB may be looking at a particular firm related to a new, you know, in the news fraud situation or something like that?
Yeah, thank you. You know, we tried when we're trying to, what is the underlying mechanism, right, that that drives these firms to respond? And when we initially looked at, our initial, when we initially designed the study, it was, we expect that the effect is localized, particularly for these smaller firms. We found some evidence of like local news media coverage, but that was really after the fact, after the enforcement came out. So, we'd have to, how it relates to this study with respect to kind of the potential of a PCAOB enforcement. My guess is that's probably the larger audit firms, but it's certainly something to think about, right? Is there, what I find interesting, right, is that, it's not publicly available until the very end, right? Which there's this huge delay. It's kind of, after the fact, if you will, this enforcement. And so, that's one thing that I think is unique and interesting about this. But, as you mentioned, right, the timing of the public release of this information is different from like an SEC administrative proceeding or something like that. So,
yeah, the two media reports of a PCAOB investigation that I'm thinking of are very recent, Mattel and Caterpillar. So in both of those cases, because of the notoriety of the issues around the company, there was a news media reports that the PCAOB was looking at the auditor, in both cases PwC. And because of the secrecy around the PCAOB process, you don't really know if that's true. Nobody from the PCAOB is going to confirm that, but it ends up in the Wall Street Journal. And the question is does that somehow scare the wits of anybody thinking that, or is that just a burnishment of the PCAOB's reputation? Is that a strategic leak to benefit the PCAOB, that they're on the job? Because no one will ever know whether or not they really are investigating, or whether or not they found anything useful or worthy of investigating. And no one will know what the disposition of it is unless or until it becomes an final enforcement action.
Yeah. I haven't looked at those, so I'll have to go look at them. That's quite interesting. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Are there another question?
Hello, good evening. At least good evening from Kuwait.
Good morning.
I have a question, and my question is, by the way, I had to disconnect because I had to talk to my wife. So my question will be this: did you try the effect of the audit firm business and the partner auditor business in your analysis, specifically for these two effects that we will be changing the audit quality? Did you make any measurements? Maybe it was asked before me. Maybe I am repeating your question. I don't know, but
no worries at all.
And my second question is, for example, did you check the diversity or the governance in the accounting firm? And diversity, it can be in terms of gender, it can be in terms of nationality. Maybe there is a legal way that is diversible.
Yeah. So to your first question with respect to audit firm busyness, we do try to control for, effectively, I think we're getting at the busyness of the firm, but we're controlling for how much their portfolio, their client portfolio changed in this post-enforcement period, which I think, I think that by abstraction that gets to the audit firm busyness. With respect to the audit partner busyness, this is a period of time where we don't have partner identification for these audits, so we can't really identify that. With respect to the diversity / governance of the audit firm, nothing in particular. We include audit firm fixed effects. So to the extent that this kind of governance or diversity element is relatively constant across time for the audit firm, that would be captured in the audit firm fixed effects, but nothing nothing beyond that.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Is there another question? Anyone have any questions? You can open your mic and ask your question. I think that you have done very well with answering a lot of questions there, dear Professor Philip. So thank you very much indeed. So all that remains for me. So to say thank you everyone that joined us, and I thank you very much for taking the time out to present to us today, dear Professor Philip. It's been really appreciated.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for this invitation. It would be nice to see you all in person. But yeah, very awesome venue, Mohammed. Thanks for doing this. I know that a lot of people are quite interested in what you're doing. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I hope to see you soon in Egypt, dear bro.
Thank you.